Okay, so let's discuss designing AMRAPs for functional fitness. It's worth noting from the start that even though it says functional fitness, and you might think these AMRAPs are specific for CrossFitters, the principles I'm going to talk about you can use with any person. They don't have to be CrossFitter, high rocks. They can just be a normal person. And maybe you want to use AMRAPs in their training design. And so you can use these ideas to help design better AMRAPs for them. So let's get into it. Okay, so discussion points. Why use AMRAPs? We're going to start there. How to design them. Give some examples, good versus bad, and then how do you advance it? How do you make it a little bit more difficult for people when the time comes, when they need a little bit more challenge? So this on the screen is an example of a tool I've used for quite some time now, for the past decade, where I'll give 10 minutes of work, they'll rest for a fixed period of time, 10 more minutes, rest, 10 more minutes, 30 minutes. And to my knowledge, the genesis of this came with the idea of accumulating a good amount of volume, training volume, for those that did want to compete in CrossFit and functional fitness, and getting practice of work periods that were similar to what you would need to do in competition, which was 10 to 15 minute pieces, especially for the CrossFit Open. And so this is just stuck as a really nice tool for training, and it's starting to expose people to AMRAPs, as many reps as possible, trying to get as many reps as you can in a fixed time window. And then, of course, giving people different combinations and exposures to work as opposed to just fixed sets, fixed combinations. So I think a lot of people use something like this in their training, or have in the past. Now the next question becomes, okay, well, how do we think about designing this? How do we structure this so that people are getting a great dose? We're hitting the nail on the head. We're not missing the mark. We're not overdoing it. So that's really what I actually want to get into, is like, how do I think about designing these, and how can we get closer to the bullseye when using them? And I'd say also just AMRAPs in general. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so why use AMRAPs? I got 3 reasons as to why you would want to use AMRAPs. The first, it's a great way to build training volume in a more sport-specific setting. So if you do have somebody who is training for something functional fitness related, could also be high rocks, you can use AMRAPs as a great way to build training volume in a setting that will replicate what they're going to actually have to do when they compete. So it's a nice bridge between training and actual game day work. So we can use AMRAPs for that. Second reason, teaches pacing and strategy. So because you have a fixed amount of time that you have to spend working, that's very helpful for people to wrap their heads around how they need to come up with a strategy, how they need to pace the work so that they can move at a great consistent rate throughout, as that being the idea that you're going after with most AMRAPs that you're designing for people. And through that, they're developing a better fitness IQ, so that when you eventually take them to work that is open-ended, so it's task dependent as opposed to time dependent, because an AMRAP would be what we'd call time dependent, because you have a fixed amount of time you're working for. Whereas if you gave them something task dependent, for example, 50 cal row, 50 wall ball, 50 kettlebell swing, 50 burpees, that's a task dependent piece of work. Now that's a little bit harder, because now the athlete has to be thinking about, well, how long will this take? How do I want to set up my pacing strategy? What pieces do I need to hold back on? Which ones should I push a little bit on? So it's a little bit more demanding. So AMRAPs act as a nice entry point to getting people to learn how to strategize, come up with a pacing structure that works for them. And finally, reason 3, learn how to turn over work as opposed to being stopped or bottlenecked. And you see this so much, especially in CrossFit, because I even remember when I was in it. You hit 3, 2, 1, go. You hit the gas, and after a minute or two, now your hands are on your knees and you're breathing. You're breaking things up. The work rate is very clunky. It's like you work really hard, then you have to rest, then you work hard and you rest, as opposed to just working at this really smooth, consistent rate for the entirety of the task. And if you watch high-level CrossFitters, or people who are very competent at CrossFit, you'll see it resemble more of that, where you'll see this nice, consistent work rate throughout, where they're pacing appropriately, they're breaking work up appropriately, so they can maintain the highest level of power throughout. And that's what I call turnover, where the turnover from round to round, movement to movement is very consistent and it's smooth. It's not very choppy. When you see the choppiness, that can be because there's a bottleneck. So you'll see that if there's a very high skilled movement, if there's a big chunk of reps of a particular movement, you'll start to see people slowing down, having to break things up. So AMRAPs act as a great way of teaching people how to work at consistent rates for extended periods of time. And eventually you extend that out, you challenge them more and more and see if they can maintain that ability to turn over the work as the challenge increases. So why use AMRAPs? One, great way to build training volume in a more specific, sport-specific setting. Two, teaches pacing and strategy, developing fitness IQ. And three, learn how to turn over work as opposed to being stopped or having a big bottleneck. So let's get into how do we design it. So how do you design AMRAPs? AMRAPs. So you can get those outcomes. So intention. First, no bottlenecks. When you design AMRAPs, you don't want to give people huge bottlenecks, because now you're moving away from turning over work and it now becomes more about how do you manage the bottleneck. Now, if you want to challenge a bottleneck, like a strict handstand push-up or a higher skilled movement for them or a heavier weight, then design it for that purpose. But if you're going to design an AMRAP, you want to design it with the intention that they're able to turn over the work consistently for the entirety of the time you're working. So no bottlenecks, consistent turnover. So you have to choose reps and movements for that person that are going to allow for consistent turnover. This is really important, and this is what I think people miss, is they won't choose movements and rep ranges that work really well for that person, and now people run into problems, have to slow down, break things up too much. Third, building confidence capacity. So with AMRAPs, the goal, of course, is to challenge people and challenge their work capacity, but you want to build confidence in their capacity, in their ability to turn over work and work at high rates for extended periods of time. So that is also a foundational piece with the AMRAP is, am I building confidence with what I'm going to design and give them, or is it just going to be too much and is it going to beat them down? That's a problem. Then we need to probably design it differently. Exposure to sport-specific movements and combinations. So if you are working with a CrossFitter or a High Rocks type client, then you're probably going to be using movements that are more sport-specific to start exposing them to those combinations that they're going to have to be capable and competent at for their actual sport. Progression, slowly moving specific movements closer to a bottleneck to challenge the person to push themselves with that movement. So to give an easy example, and we'll get into some more, let's say the movement you're trying to elevate is a ring muscle up. You might design, if I go back to this example, notice how there's only 3 ring muscle ups in this first AMRAP. And let's say the person can do 10 unbroken, no problem. 3 in this context might be just enough challenge, so they're consistently doing 3 unbroken. They're moving the thrusters to the bike and they're going around and around and around for 10 minutes. That's like a great dose. They're getting great practice. They're building confidence in movement. How we would progress that, per what I wrote here, is the next week you could do 4. It could be 4 muscle ups, 8 overhead squats, 16 cal row. And so now you're challenging them a little bit more. You're extending out that challenging movement. The week after that, it could be 5. It could go 5 muscle ups, 10 thrusters, 15 cal echo bike. So each week you're just adding a little bit. And with that example, I'm keeping the patterns and the combinations pretty similar. You could change that. The one thing you would be focusing on, though, is the muscle up in that particular piece of work, where you're just trying to slowly challenge the muscle up a little bit more, and you're trying to extend the amount of work that they have to do with that movement. And so that's one of the key progressions for the AMRAP, is I'm slowly trying to make these movements that are challenging for them, moving it closer to a bottleneck to stretch them a little bit. So if I was to look at AMRAPs I gave somebody last year compared to this year, I should see that certain movements are being stretched a little bit more. They're getting challenged a little bit more. That would reflect that, of course, that they've gotten better and they've made progress, but I'm also progressing the AMRAPs to challenge them a little further. Okay, so let's practice. Let's put this into play. So the avatar we have, male, 24 years old, 5'9", goal, compete in CrossFit. Train age, 7 years of CrossFit training. Ability, snatch, 265, clean jerk, 305, back squat, 400, deadlift, 500. AMRAP unbroken ring muscles, 15, handstand push-ups, 20. Task, design 3 10-minute AMRAPs aimed at challenging and developing his gymnastic capacity. Okay, so fairly trained individual. He's obviously strong, can do a lot of movements. He has no problems with gymnastics, so we don't have any movement limitations or constraints, so that's really important. And we want to give him AMRAPs that are challenging, developing his gymnastic capacity, specific to CrossFit. So that's a key caveat. So here's a good example of 2 10-minute AMRAPs designing to stress his gymnastics, but still allowing him to turn over work. So look how I wrote these. I put the gymnastic movement on the tail end of a round. So the one round being row, thruster, bar muscle up, ski, power snatch, handstand push-up. So at the tail end, so he's already worked for, let's say, a minute 15, and then he has to go into the bar muscle up. So he's accumulating fatigue, then he has to go into the bar muscle up. Same with the wall handstand push-up. Accumulates fatigue, then he has to go into the handstand push-up. So this is going to be more challenging than if I did the opposite ordering, where I had bar muscle up first, then thruster, then row. Obviously, he's still accumulating fatigue in that example. However, before he goes to the bar muscle up, he has the row and the ski for the handstand push-up to allow him to kind of slow down and control the fatigue he's accumulating. With this format, I'm putting a movement before the muscle up, the handstand push-up, that's harder to control the fatigue. So he has to learn, he has to deal with that and better understand, like, well, what cadence can I go at to ensure I'm not too fatigued for the bar muscle up? Can I do these unbroken? Which, again, remember, turnover is key, which is why I gave him 7 thrusters instead of like 12 or 15, because then he maybe would have to break those up. And if he did go unbroken with them, he'd probably be too fatigued to do these unbroken, and then that might catch up by the 3rd round. So this structuring puts an adequate amount of challenge on the bar muscle up the wall facing handstand push-up. Repetition ranges are aligned higher, turnover, no bottlenecks, so you can constantly be moving. More complementary based combinations, so that's really important. Squatting and pulling, bending and pushing. Of course, the ski, there's a little bit of fatigue accumulating in the triceps and lats, but again, we can control the pace, so if he gets a little ahead of it, he can pull back a little bit. And then rowing again, pulling, but again, the thrusters between the two, so he's getting a break from the pulling musculature when he's doing this, which is great. And then leveraging cyclical machine to help regulate pacing. So I kind of talked over my 3 little points, but this would be a good example of how do we design AMRAPs so he can have great turnover of the work, we can challenge certain movements, we can build confidence, and get him into a better spot with his work capacity. So here's a bad example. Similar, I didn't write the weight. I feel I'm a little frustrated I didn't do that, but that's okay. Let's assume it's 50 pounds, 22 and a half kilos. So let me pull this up. Bottleneck movements are too large in repetition range. Turnover will be low to non-existent. So 15 strict handstand push-ups, 15 bar muscle-ups. Way too aggressive for this particular individual. So that's a problem. It's going to have to break them up. It's going to slow them down. There's no turnover. Not enough separation from bottleneck movement to allow for adequate recovery of energy needed to perform the movement. So he's not enough separation from bottleneck movement to allow for adequate recovery of energy needed to perform the movement. Okay, so what I mean by that is he doesn't have enough time away from this movement to recuperate the draining of his battery that he's going to experience when he does this movement. So if you were going to give him 15 strict handstand push-ups, let's say he broke that up. Say it took him a minute to perform those. He probably needs a good 2 to 3 minutes elsewhere to recuperate some of that so he can come back and repeat taking 15 in about a minute. Otherwise, it's just going to get longer and longer. But he only has 12 dumbbell snatch alternating, which will take 25 seconds. And then he's got 9 cal ski, which maybe it takes 30, 35 seconds. So you're looking at, let's say, a minute. So it takes him a minute here, and then he's got a minute here, and he's going back. That's not great. He would need more time between the handstand push-up and the other movements. And then same idea with the bar muscle-up. And then not leveraging cyclical machines to help regulate pace. So the row and the ski at 9 cals is pretty much insignificant. So he's not going to be able to leverage that to help regulate pace because he's not going to be on it long enough. He could. He's just going to go super slow, but now you're missing the whole point of why you're designing the AMRAP the way you should be designing it. So bottleneck movements are too big, not enough time away from them, and then the cyclical machine is not being leveraged appropriately. Okay, so for advanced clients, people who have done a lot of that type of training, they know themselves well, they're strong, they're capable, have great muscle endurance. Now you go the opposite direction. Instead of trying to help them learn how to turnover work, you're now almost like you're trying to prevent them from doing that. It's like, you do that really well, I'm going to try to get in your way and make it hard for you to do that. So you're trying to challenge repeatability. So in this example, one of the first things you'll probably notice, there's much bigger sets. So the simplest way to ensure turnover is doable for the person is you make the sets small, which doesn't create a lot of local muscle fatigue. And if you don't create a lot of local muscle fatigue, the fatigue is moving around the body that allows you to work at higher rates. When we create bigger sets of work, so we extend out the muscle endurance demand, now you're going to start slowing down the turnover rate because you're going to have to pace and partition the work so you can get through it more effectively. So that's the first thing we notice here that I changed to challenge repeatability is big extended sets. Non-complementary combinations, not too severe, but beginning to expose them to that. So row, wall ball, bar muscle up, I guess you could say kind of non-complementary. It's not, if this was a kettlebell swing or deadlift, then it would be more non-complementary, but it's not too different than the row thruster muscle up. So I'm giving myself a little leeway here. But ski, GHD, strict handstand push-up, that's going to be a little bit more non-complementary because you're going to be getting a lot of midline fatigue, then you're bending. So it's just going to make this hard. It's harder to breathe. You're going to be, of course, accumulating fatigue in the upper body. So that's going to be challenging, but this isn't that severe. So it's like we're starting to expose them, but it's not full-blown yet, which is good because that allows us to work at a higher work rate, which is good. We don't want, because that's the trade-off. High turnover is going to allow for a lot more work to be done, which is good, but you're probably not going to maximize the development of a movement in its capacities because you're condensing the stress that's placed on it. So we're starting to extend the work sets, which is going to slow down probably the work rate. They're going to get a lot of work done, but we're now starting to stress these movements more. Trying to push them to near failure, have to partition the work more than they'd otherwise want. So with this type of design, as in almost all AMRAPs, I always want them to be holding unbroken sets of work with everything, ideally. So this should push them a little bit where they're like, I could do this unbroken. Can I do that for every round? And so if somebody who's more advanced, they'd be thinking about it. They'd go, okay, 21 cal, that's going to take me, say, 105, 15 GHCs, 30 seconds, 105, 9 strict. So say 2-minute rounds. So I got to do 5 rounds, roughly, maybe 5 into the 6. Can I hold 9 for 5 rounds with this format? And that's what I would be wanting them to be thinking about. And ideally, they're like, yeah, I can do it. Let's go for it. And then same up here too. Can I hold 10 for 4 rounds? And the answer should be, yeah, let's try for it. So that's how we would be approaching the thinking process for more advanced clients. Is I now want to challenge that idea of turning over work and stress them a little bit more and see how well they handle that. And it goes without saying, I know I've waited now 22 minutes to say this, but each week when you design, you're going to review, of course, how the client did with those AMRAPs. And if they were on the mark, great. Keep with that thread. If you're a little off, then we course correct, make the change we need so we get the right dose. So that's, of course, the power in watching week to week how people are handling the training so you can get closer and closer to the bullseye. So wrapping up, AMRAPs are essential tools for building training volume, improving pace, developing fitness IQ in a sports-specific context. Thoughtful design is key. Avoid bottlenecks, prioritize consistent turnover, build confidence with sports-specific movements. If you forget everything else I say, just remember that. Bottlenecks, avoid bottlenecks, consistent turnover, build confidence. Progression matters. Gradually introduce challenging elements to push athletes without compromising their ability to sustain effort. So start with simple things. Start with things that people can handle and work with really well, and then slowly start to add in the elements that are a little more challenging for them. And then finally, practicality drives results. Ensure AMRAPs are tailored to the athlete's skill level and intended training goals for maximum effectiveness. All right, that is it. I hope that was helpful. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thanks, guys.